They thought I was broke after the divorce, so I let them fight over my old house. They thought I was broke after the divorce, completely ruined, without a penny to my name, living on borrowed time in the old house that was supposedly all I had left from a 15-year marriage. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 42 years old, and this is the story of how I let my former in-laws fight like vultures over a property whose true value they had no idea about. A property that would give me the last laugh in a war they started, but one that I would finish. The situation reached a breaking point on a cold January morning when I received a call from my ex-sister-in-law, Patricia. Her voice had that fake tone of concern I knew all too well. "Rebecca, dear, I know things have been tough for you since the divorce. We're worried about your financial situation." I almost laughed out loud. Patricia had never worried about me in 15 years of family life, but now, 6 months after my contentious divorce from her brother David, she was full of solicitude. "Thank you for your concern, Patricia," I replied, keeping my voice neutral as I sipped coffee in the kitchen of my home in Riverside, California. It was a modest 3-bedroom house built in 1987 with a facade that needed a new coat of paint and a garden I didn't have time to properly care for. To any casual observer, it looked exactly like what it was: the residence of a middle-aged woman going through financial hardship after a complicated divorce. "Well, we had an idea," Patricia continued, and I could practically hear the calculating smile in her voice. "You know that house must hold a lot of bad memories, right? And with the whole financial situation, maybe it's time to consider selling. We could help you with that." Help. That word always sounded funny coming from David's family. Throughout our entire marriage, the only help they offered came with strings attached and unspoken expectations. "In fact," she went on, "Michael and I were talking, and we'd be willing to buy the house from you, for a fair market value, of course. You could use the money to start a new life, maybe rent a little apartment somewhere cheaper." Michael was Patricia's husband, an accountant who had always treated me as if I were slightly stupid with numbers. The irony of this situation was delicious in a way they couldn't possibly imagine. What Patricia and the rest of the Walker family didn't know was that my financial situation was far from desperate. In fact, I was much better off than I had been at any point during my marriage to David. But I had worked very hard to cultivate this image of a struggling recent divorcee, and I wasn't about to ruin the act now, just when things were getting interesting. "That's a generous offer," I said, putting just the right amount of hesitation in my voice. "Can I think about it?" Patricia practically purred with satisfaction. "Of course, dear, but don't take too long to decide. The real estate market can change quickly, and our offer might not stand forever." The veiled threat was there, clear as day. It was typical of the Walker family, always using pressure disguised as a favor. After I hung up, I sat in my simple kitchen, looking out the window at the messy backyard, and smiled for the first time in weeks. They really thought they were clever. They thought they had found a perfect opportunity to get a cheap property by taking advantage of my desperation. What they didn't know was that 6 years ago, when I inherited this seemingly worthless house from my Aunt Eleanor, I had discovered something that would change everything. The house sat on a 2-acre lot in an area that, at the time, seemed forgotten by urban development. But old documents I found in the attic revealed that the property had historical mineral rights that had never properly explored. More importantly, a recent urban development survey had identified this exact area as the future premium commercial corridor of Riverside. In less than 2 years, my worthless property would be at the center of the city's largest development project. But I hadn't told anyone about this. Not even David during our marriage. Especially not David, considering how our relationship had deteriorated in recent years. And now, with the divorce finalized and his family circling like vultures, I finally had the perfect opportunity for a revenge that would be both profitable and satisfying. To understand how I got to this point, I need to go back to the beginning of my story with the Walker family. I met David in 2008 at a digital marketing conference in San Diego. I was 27, working as an independent consultant and just starting to build a solid career in the field. David was charming, well-spoken, and had that confident air that attracts insecure women. Unfortunately, at the time, I fit that category perfectly. Our courtship was a whirlwind of expensive dinners, romantic trips, and grand promises about our future together. David worked as a sales manager for a software company and made good money, though not as much as he liked to pretend. He had a habit of living slightly beyond his means, always buying more expensive cars, designer clothes, and the latest tech gadgets. At the time, I found it sophisticated and ambitious. His family welcomed me with what I interpreted as affection, but what I now recognize as a calculated evaluation. His mother, Dorothy Walker, was an elegant woman in her early 60s who had spent her entire life as an upper-middle-class housewife. She would ask me subtle questions about my family, my education, my financial prospects, always disguised as genuine maternal interest. "Rebecca, dear," she said during a Sunday lunch at their home in Newport Beach, "David told us you're self-employed. That must be unstable, isn't it?" The word unstable dripped from her mouth as if it were slightly poisonous. Have you ever thought about finding something more secure, especially if you two are thinking about getting married? The message was clear. I needed a more respectable job if I wanted to be part of the family. Patricia, who at the time had already been married to Michael for 5 years, was more direct. During one of David's birthday parties, she pulled me aside and said, "You know David has always been ambitious, right? He's going to need a wife who complements his goals, not one who holds him back." When I asked what she meant, she smiled sweetly. "Just that a partnership is about building something together. David has the potential to go very far in his career." What they didn't know was that my consulting business was doing very well. I had developed a specialization in digital marketing for small businesses and had a growing list of satisfied clients. But they never asked about the success of my work, only about its stability and whether I was earning enough to adequately contribute to the lifestyle David wanted to maintain. We got married in June 2009 in an elegant ceremony that cost more than I made in 6 months. The Walker family insisted on paying for the party, which I thought was generous at the time, but later understood was a way to maintain control over the event and make it clear who was really in charge. During the reception, I overheard Patricia commenting to a cousin, "Well, at least she seems willing to work hard. David is going to need someone like that." The first few years of marriage were reasonably happy, but I began to notice troubling patterns. David always made important financial decisions alone, then informed me as if I were a junior partner in our own life. When we bought our first house, he chose the location, negotiated the price, and signed the papers. My name was on the documents, but I didn't really participate in any of the decisions. "You don't understand the real estate market, Becca," he'd say whenever I tried to give an opinion. "Let me handle these things." It was always like that. He handled the finances, he handled the investments, he handled everything important. My role was to work hard, contribute my income, and support his decisions without question. When my Aunt Eleanor died in 2017 and left me the house in Riverside, the Walker family had an interesting reaction. David immediately wanted to sell the property. "It's an old house in a dead-end neighborhood," he declared after a single visit. "We can sell it and use the money to improve our situation here," Patricia agreed. "Rebecca, you have to be practical. A property that doesn't appreciate is dead money." But something about the house touched me deeply. My Aunt Eleanor had been an independent and determined woman who built an interesting life for herself. The house had history, character, and offered me something I hadn't had in years, a place that was completely mine. Against the wishes of the Walker family, I decided to keep the property and use it as a personal office and retreat. It was during the renovations that I discovered the documents in the attic. Old contracts, survey maps, and legal correspondence that revealed my aunt had been far more shrewd than anyone had imagined. She knew about the area's development potential and had strategically positioned herself for the future. Guys, if you have an elderly person in your family who seems to have made strange investments or decisions that don't make sense, it might be worth investigating more deeply. Sometimes older people see things that we, in our rush, completely miss. My Aunt Eleanor taught me that, even after she was gone. And if you're enjoying this story about how appearances can be deceiving, stick with me, because what comes next will show how David and his family completely underestimated the person they thought they knew. The deterioration of my marriage to David began subtly but accelerated dramatically after I discovered the true value of Aunt Eleanor's property. The problem wasn't just that he wanted me to sell the house, it was that he started treating my decision to keep it as evidence of financial incompetence. "Rebecca, you're being emotional about this," he'd say whenever the topic came up. "Real estate investment is about numbers, not feelings." What made the situation more ironic was that David considered himself a smart investor, but all of his big deals invariably lost money. He had invested $20,000 in an app startup that went bankrupt in 6 months. He lost $15,000 on shares of a solar energy company that never got off the ground. There was even a stake in a restaurant that closed after a year. But somehow, I was the one who didn't understand investments. The Walker family fully supported David's questionable financial decisions, but criticized me for holding on to a property that was tying up capital. During a Thanksgiving dinner in 2019, Patricia brought up the topic again. "Rebecca, I don't mean to meddle," she said, though that was exactly what she was doing, "but you two should be focusing on building wealth together. A sentimental property is a luxury you can't afford." Michael, always ready with numbers and charts, had even prepared a presentation showing how the money from the house sale could be better invested. "Look here," he said, pointing to his laptop. "If you sell for $150,000 and invest it in an S&P 500 index fund, in 10 years you'll have approximately $300,000. It was a solid analysis, based on average historical returns. What he didn't know was that my property would be worth over $2 million in less than 3 years. During this period, I began to notice worrying changes in David's behavior. He was becoming more controlling, more critical, and less interested in anything I had to say about our joint finances. When my consulting business started to grow significantly in 2020, thanks to the increased demand for digital marketing during the pandemic, he reacted strangely. "You're working too much," he would complain, when I spent entire afternoons at the office in the Riverside house. "It's not healthy for our marriage." But when I suggested we could perhaps hire a cleaner or a gardener with the extra income, he would say we needed to be more conservative with our spending. It was a contradiction that made no sense until I found out what was really going on. In December 2020, I accidentally opened an email addressed to David on our shared computer. It was from a divorce attorney discussing strategies for asset protection in the event of marital dissolution. My blood ran cold. David had been consulting a divorce lawyer for months, apparently planning a separation without telling me. But what shocked me most was the list of assets he had provided to the lawyer. Our main house was valued correctly. Our joint bank accounts were listed accurately. But the Riverside house was listed as low-value inherited property, approximately $120,000. He had deliberately undervalued my most valuable asset in his legal documentation. That night, when David came home from work, I was waiting in the living room with a printed copy of the email. "We need to talk," I said, placing the paper on the coffee table between us. He went pale when he saw what I was holding. "Rebecca, I can explain," he started, but I cut him off. "You've been planning to divorce me for months and said nothing," I declared, keeping my voice surprisingly calm. "Not only that, you're deliberately lying about the value of my assets to your lawyer." David sat down heavily on the sofa, running his hands through his hair. "Look, our marriage hasn't been working for a long time. You know that." "Then why didn't you talk to me about it like an adult?" I asked. "Why all this secret plotting with lawyers?" He looked at me with an expression that mixed guilt and irritation. "Because I knew you would make everything complicated. You always complicate financial matters." The irony of that statement, coming from a man who had lost tens of thousands of dollars on bad investments, would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. What followed were 3 months of the worst arguments of my adult life. David moved into the guest room, and we communicated mostly through lawyers. He continued to insist that the Riverside house was worth only $120,000, and his lawyer presented an independent appraisal that conveniently arrived at the same number. My lawyer, Karen Holdbrook, a sharp woman who had handled hundreds of divorce cases, immediately suspected something was wrong. "Rebecca, this appraisal seems way too low for the area," she told me during one of our meetings. "Do you have any additional information about this property that might be relevant?" It was the question I had been waiting for, and the time had finally come to play my strongest card. When I showed Karen Holbrook all the documents I had found in Aunt Eleanor's attic, along with the urban development reports I had quietly commissioned, her expression changed completely. She studied the papers for nearly an hour, taking notes and cross-referencing information. "Rebecca," she finally said, "do you have any idea what you're holding here?" I knew exactly what I was holding, but I wanted to hear confirmation from a professional. "Your property isn't worth $120,000, Karen continued, organizing the documents on the table. "With the historical mineral rights, the strategic location, and especially with the commercial development project being finalized by the city, this property is worth at least $1.5 million, and that's being conservative." My heart raced, not with surprise, but with satisfaction. Finally, someone besides me understood the true magnitude of what David was trying to do. "What does this mean for the divorce?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Karen smiled for the first time since we had met. "It means your ex-husband is attempting to commit large-scale marital fraud. He is deliberately concealing and undervaluing significant marital assets. This not only strengthens your case, but could result in criminal consequences for him." We decided to keep this information secret for the time being. Karen developed a brilliant strategy. We would let David and his lawyer continue to insist on the low appraisal, gathering evidence of bad faith and fraudulent behavior. When the time was right, we would reveal the true situation in a devastating fashion. Meanwhile, the Walker family intensified their campaign to convince me to quickly accept the divorce settlement David had proposed. Patricia called me weekly with advice on how it would be better for me to move on quickly. "Rebecca, dear, prolonged legal battles only benefit the lawyers," she'd say in that fake concerned voice. "David is being very generous by offering to split everything 50-50. 50-50 based on fraudulent appraisals, of course. According to David's proposal, I would get the Riverside house valued at $120,000, our joint savings of $80,000, and half the value of the main house after the mortgage was paid off, totaling approximately $400,000. He would keep the remaining assets, including his investment and retirement accounts. It seemed equitable to someone who didn't know the real situation. Michael, always present with unsolicited financial analyses, even created a spreadsheet showing how I could maximize my post-divorce situation. "See, Rebecca," he explained during an awkward meeting at a cafe, "if you sell the Riverside house immediately and invest the $120,000 along with your share of the savings, you'll have a decent financial cushion to start your new life." His condescension was almost impressive. What none of them knew was that I had started receiving calls from real estate developers interested in my property. The news about the development project had begun to leak in specialized real estate circles, and very well-informed people were making preliminary offers. One development company offered $1,200,000 for the land alone without even seeing the house. "Keep these offers strictly confidential," Karen advised me. "We want full documentation of the fraud attempt before we reveal our position." It was a risky but potentially devastating strategy for David's case. Every day that passed with him insisting on the low appraisal strengthened our evidence of intentional fraudulent behavior. During this period, David became increasingly aggressive in the negotiations. When I hesitated to quickly sign the divorce papers, he started making veiled threats. "Rebecca, you don't have experience with complex legal matters," he said during one of our few in-person conversations. "My lawyer is much more experienced than yours. If you drag this out, you could end up with much less than what's being offered now." His threats were particularly ironic, considering I was sitting on information that would render any legal threat from him completely useless. But I maintained my expression of a confused and intimidated woman. "I just need more time to understand everything," I replied, letting a hint of vulnerability into my voice. It was important that he continue to underestimate my position. The situation came to a head when Dorothy Walker, the family matriarch, decided to intervene personally. She showed up at my door one afternoon, unannounced, carrying homemade cookies and a fake maternal smile. "Rebecca, dear, may I come in? I think it's time we had a woman-to-woman talk." I knew exactly what was coming, but I let her in anyway. Dorothy made herself at home in my living room, serving tea and arranging the cookies on a plate as if she were the hostess. "Dear, I know this whole situation is very difficult for you," she began, using that tone experienced mothers use with misbehaving children. "But sometimes when a marriage isn't working, the most mature thing to do is to accept it and move on gracefully." Gracefully, in Dorothy's vocabulary, meant quietly accepting whatever David wanted to do. She went on for 20 minutes explaining how it would be better for me, for David, and for the whole family if I simply signed the papers and started a new chapter in my life. What she was really saying was, stop complicating my son's plans and agree to be quietly swindled. When she finally left, leaving the cookies as if they were some kind of bribe, I called Karen. "I think it's time," I said. "They're escalating the pressure because they know something isn't right. It's time to show our cards." Karen agreed. "Let's schedule a meeting with his lawyer for next week. It's time to see his face when he finds out what's really at stake." The meeting took place in a conference room at the office of David's lawyer, Richard Blackstone, a pompous man in his 50s who clearly thought he was dealing with a routine divorce case. David was there, wearing his best suit, with a confident expression of someone who believed he would finally force a favorable settlement. Patricia and Michael were also present, supposedly as moral support, but I knew they were there for what they thought would be my final capitulation. Karen walked into the room carrying 3 thick binders and an expression I had learned to recognize. It was her face when she was about to legally destroy someone. "Good morning, everyone," she said politely, arranging her documents with military precision. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. We have some important issues to discuss regarding the asset valuation." Richard Blackstone leaned back in his chair, clearly thinking this would be just another routine negotiation session. "Of course, let's get this settled once and for all," he said with that arrogance only expensive lawyers can project. My client has been more than generous in the proposed division. We hope your client will be equally reasonable. Interesting that you mention reasonableness, Karen replied, opening the first binder. Because we've discovered some significant discrepancies in the asset documentation provided by your client. She placed a copy of the real estate appraisal David had submitted on the table. Is this appraisal of the Riverside property correct? David glanced quickly at his lawyer before answering. Yes, that is a professional, independent appraisal. $120,000 is the fair market value for that property. His voice sounded confident, but I noticed he was drumming his fingers nervously on the table. Karen smiled in a way that made my heart race. Interesting, because we also commissioned an independent appraisal. She pulled a thick document from the second binder. This appraisal, conducted by Morrison & Associates, one of the most respected firms in California, values the same property at $1,800,000. The silence in the room was deafening. David turned white as a sheet. Richard Blackstone stopped pretending to be confident and began frantically flipping through his own documents. Patricia let out a small, strangled noise, and Michael looked like he had stopped breathing entirely. "That's impossible," David finally stammered. "It's just an old house in an undeveloped neighborhood." Karen opened the third binder, revealing maps, government reports, and historical legal documents. Actually, it's not. The property includes historical mineral rights that were never properly documented in previous appraisals. More significantly, it is located at the epicenter of Riverside's largest commercial development project for the next 10 years. She spread the documents on the table like cards from a winning hand. We have here the official city plans, approved last month, for a shopping center and office complex that will make this property one of the most valuable in the region. We also have 3 documented purchase offers, all over $1.5 million. Richard Blackstone was clearly trying to process the legal implications of the situation. "Are you alleging that my client deliberately undervalued marital assets?" he asked, his voice losing all its previous arrogance. Karen nodded gravely. "We're not alleging, we're documenting, and that constitutes marital fraud, which is both a civil and potentially a criminal matter." David tried desperately to defend himself. "I didn't know. No one told me about these mineral rights or the development." But Karen was prepared for that, too. She pulled more documents from the binder. "Interesting, because here we have your internet records from the last 6 months, legally obtained through the discovery process. You conducted extensive research on real estate development in Riverside, visited city government websites, and even contacted 2 appraisal firms before choosing the one that gave the lowest value." The evidence was devastating and irrefutable. David not only knew about the property's potential, but had actively worked to hide it. Patricia was staring at her brother with a look of growing horror, finally understanding that not only was I not broke, but that David had tried to commit a crime to cheat me. "What do you want?" Richard asked, clearly trying to mitigate the damage. Karen smiled again, and this time it was a genuinely joyful smile. "We want a fair division of assets based on accurate appraisals. Considering the attempted fraud, my client is willing to accept 70% of the total marital assets, including the correctly valued Riverside property." The numbers were staggering. With the property worth almost $2 million, plus our main house and other savings, we were talking about total assets of over $3 million. 70% meant more than $2 million for me, leaving David with approximately $800,000, still a substantial amount, but far less than what he had hoped to get through fraud. "And if we refuse?" David asked, his voice now a defeated whisper. Karen gathered her documents with evident satisfaction. Then we will take everything to court, where a judge will decide not only on the division of assets, but also on the consequences of the attempted fraud. This could include significant fines and potentially prison time. Furthermore, all additional legal costs will come out of his share. Patricia finally found her voice. Rebecca, you knew all along? I looked at her with the most innocent expression I could muster. Knew about what, Patricia? About the real value of my property? Or about how your entire family was trying to pressure me into agreeing to be robbed? The embarrassment on her face was almost palpable. Guys, you have no idea how satisfying it is to watch people who tried to take advantage of you discover that they completely underestimated the person they thought they knew. If you've ever been in situations where someone tried to take advantage of you, thinking you were naive or desperate, tell me about it in the comments. These stories of justice being served are important for all of us. And if you want to know how this whole saga ended, how the family reacted when they realized I wasn't the poor little thing they thought I was, stay with me because the ending is even better. David signed the agreement 3 days later. He didn't really have a choice. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of attempted fraud and the potential criminal consequences, even Richard Blackstone advised him to accept the terms. The signing took place in the same office where the truth had been revealed, but this time David arrived alone, without the moral support of the family, who now saw him in a very different light. Rebecca, I need you to know I never wanted things to get to this point, he said when we had a few moments alone in the conference room. There was something pathetic in his voice, an attempt to reclaim some dignity in the situation. I thought it would be simpler this way. Simpler. That word perfectly summed up how David saw life, always looking for the easiest path, even if it meant hurting other people. Simpler would have been talking to me about the divorce like an adult, I replied, signing the last documents. Simpler would have been dividing our assets honestly. What you tried to do wasn't simple, David. It was criminal. He had no answer for that. For the first time in 15 years of our relationship, David Walker was completely speechless. The reaction of the Walker family was even more interesting than David's. Patricia called me the next day, and the difference in her tone of voice was almost comical. Rebecca, dear, I hope you know we never intended to. If we had known about the real situation with the property. She was clearly trying to do damage control, realizing she had spent months trying to pressure someone who was in a much stronger position than she had imagined. Patricia, I interrupted gently, you spent 8 months treating me like I was a desperate and financially incompetent woman. You tried to pressure me into making decisions that would have severely harmed me. And you did it all based on David's word, without ever bothering to check the facts for yourselves. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Michael had an even more interesting reaction. He showed up at my door 2 weeks after the final agreement, bringing an expensive bottle of wine and an embarrassed smile. Rebecca, I came to apologize in person. As an accountant, I should have noticed the discrepancies in the appraisal. It was a professional failure on my part. He was clearly worried that I might use his participation in the fraudulent negotiations against him professionally. Michael, you didn't fail professionally, I said, letting him in but not offering to open the wine. You failed as a person. You allowed your loyalty to your brother-in-law to override your professional ethics. And more importantly, you actively participated in an attempt to harm me financially. His expression showed that he finally understood the gravity of what he had done. Dorothy Walker took longer to get in touch, but when she finally called, it was with a surprising proposal. Rebecca, dear, I know things got complicated, but you are still family to us. I would like to talk about how we can mend our relationship. It was fascinating how the discovery of my true financial situation had completely changed her perception of me. Dorothy, for 15 years, you treated me like a tolerable intruder in David's life. For the last few months, you tried to manipulate me into accepting being robbed. The only thing that has changed is that now you know I have money. My frankness left her speechless for a moment. I'm not interested in mending a relationship that was never genuine to begin with. What surprised me most was finding out how the news spread through the Walker family's social circles. Apparently, the story of David trying to defraud his ex-wife and being caught with documented evidence became prime gossip at Newport Beach social events. Patricia told me, without realizing the irony, that several people had commented on how impressive it was that I had been so clever throughout the whole process. Clever, as if careful planning, documenting evidence, and hiring competent legal representation was some kind of genius move instead of responsible adult behavior. Their reaction revealed a lot about how they saw me before, as someone incapable of properly taking care of herself. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected call from David. He was calling from the small apartment he had rented in Irvine, a significant lifestyle change, considering he was used to large houses and expensive cars. Rebecca, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I'm going through some financial difficulties. Do you think it would be possible for us to talk about a loan? The audacity of the question was almost admirable. The man who had tried to steal $1.5 million from me was now asking to borrow money. David, you have $800,000 from our asset division. How can you be having financial difficulties? The answer revealed a lot about who he really was. Well, I invested most of it in a few opportunities that didn't pan out, he admitted reluctantly. And the legal costs were higher than I expected. Besides, maintaining the standard of living, he had basically thrown away his share of the settlement on new, risky investments and unnecessary expenses, exactly as I always knew he would. David, no, I replied simply. I am not going to lend you money, I am not going to help you financially, and I am not going to save you from the consequences of your own decisions. You've made your bed, now lie in it. It was the last conversation we ever had, and I intend to keep it that way. Today, 2 years after my divorce, I can say it was the best thing that happened to me in decades. With over $2 million in assets, including the Riverside property, which is now worth even more due to the area's accelerated development, I have a financial freedom I never imagined possible. But more important than the money is the freedom to be myself without constantly having to navigate the toxic dynamics of the Walker family. Aunt Eleanor's property has become more than just a profitable investment. It has become my sanctuary. I completely renovated the house, maintaining its historic charm while adding all the modern amenities I always wanted. I have a beautiful office where my consulting business continues to thrive, a garden I can finally care for properly, and a peace of mind I haven't felt in years. The most interesting thing is how people treat me differently now that they know about my financial situation. Old acquaintances who barely spoke to me during my marriage to David now invite me to lunches and social events. It's revealing to realize how many superficial friendships I maintained simply for social convenience, and how refreshing it is to be selective about who I choose to spend my time with. My relationship with work has also completely changed. With guaranteed financial security, I can choose projects based on interest and impact rather than financial need. I started working with small, sole proprietor businesses, especially women entrepreneurs, helping them build strong digital presences. It's gratifying to use my expertise to help people who truly need and deserve success. The most important lesson I learned is that sometimes people show who they really are when they think you are vulnerable. David and his family treated me completely differently when they thought I was desperate and financially dependent. They revealed a calculated cruelty that I had never seen during the good times of our marriage. I also learned that underestimating someone can be a very expensive mistake. The Walker family assumed I was passive, financially incompetent, and easily manipulated. They created an image of me based on 15 years of watching me play the role of a submissive wife without ever considering that I might have strength, intelligence, and resources they didn't know about. Most importantly, I learned that it is possible to completely rebuild your life, even after years in a situation that seemed limiting. During my marriage, I had gradually allowed David and his family to define my value and my potential. Reclaiming my financial and personal autonomy reminded me of capabilities I had forgotten I possessed. As for David, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he continues to struggle financially. He has changed jobs twice, apparently because his reputation in the industry deteriorated after the story of the divorce spread. Patricia and Michael moved to Arizona, allegedly for a new beginning, though I suspect they wanted to escape the local social embarrassment. Dorothy Walker sent me a Christmas card last year, a gesture I interpreted as a final attempt to maintain some kind of connection. The card had a handwritten note. "I hope you are well and happy. You were always stronger than we realized." It was the closest to an apology she could manage. I did not reply to the card, not out of malice, but because I genuinely have no interest in maintaining any kind of relationship with people who only respect me now that they know I have money. Authentic relationships don't work that way. Today, when I look back, I can see that everything happened exactly as it was supposed to. If David hadn't tried to defraud me, I probably would have accepted a fair division of assets that would have left me with much less. If the Walker family hadn't pressured me so aggressively, I might have revealed the property situation sooner, losing the opportunity to fully document the fraud attempt. Ironically, their greed and dishonesty created the perfect conditions for my complete financial independence. They literally handed me all the leverage I needed to secure not just a fair division, but compensation for the attempted fraud. Aunt Eleanor's house continues to be the center of my new life. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in the garden she planted decades ago, drinking coffee in the kitchen she designed, I feel as if she knew exactly what she was doing when she left me this property. She gave me more than a house. She gave me the tools to reclaim my power and build a life that is completely, authentically mine. For anyone going through a difficult divorce, especially if you suspect your spouse isn't being honest about assets, document everything, hire competent representation, and never accept appraisals that seem suspicious. Sometimes people try to take advantage of you when they think you are weak or desperate. Don't let them. You have more strength and resources than they imagine. And for those who think they can manipulate or defraud people based on assumptions about weakness or desperation, remember that appearances can be very deceiving. Sometimes the person you are trying to exploit is holding cards you don't even dream exist. And when those cards are played, the consequences can be much more severe than you ever imagined. Today, I wake up every morning in my beautiful house, grateful not just for the financial security, but for the freedom to live authentically. It's a type of wealth that goes far beyond numbers and bank accounts. It's the wealth of knowing exactly who I am and what I'm capable of, independent of what anyone else thinks or expects. And that, in the end, is the best revenge of all, living well, authentically, and completely on your own terms.